Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, tonight I want to talk about the topic of climate change and the shortcomings of the environmental movement in relation to the way it talks about climate change and its activism around climate change. So, you probably heard about what happened in New York last week or a few days ago. Just gigantic floods. I think they had like 8 inches of rain in just a few hours. And those sorts of things have been happening in various places all over the world. It's happened in various cities in China. Here in Bloomington, Indiana, where I live, we had a similar situation as New York, where we had like 8 inches of rain in a matter of 3 or 4 hours, something like that. And, our house was flooded, the streets were flooded. It was really bad. We had wildfires in Western Canada all summer that were so widespread that they spread smoke and haze all over the United States and eastern United States and Canada. We had record heat waves in various parts of the world. So there were all kinds of records set in European countries, which mostly houses don't have air conditioning. 110, things like that. So temperatures that you would never see in Northern Europe. We had the uh, wildfire in Hawaii, worst fire disaster in history. Where you have glaciers just breaking off right and left. And yeah, there's just no doubt that climate change is happening. Um, and not only do scientists with relevant expertise overwhelmingly, something like 97 or 98%, according to polls, believe it's happening, but overwhelmingly they believe that it's anthropogenic, that is caused by humans. And about a week prior to the floods in New York, a few days prior, they had a massive demonstration, massive protest against climate change, attended by various luminaries such as AOC, Cornell West was there, lots of different environmental groups. And the theme of the protest was hashtag in fossil fuels. So, what I want to talk about tonight, which I briefly got into last week, is just that, you know, stopping or phasing out fossil fuel use would be a good thing because certainly the burning of fossil fuels puts lots of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, that have a greenhouse effect. They trap uh, heat in the atmosphere and therefore warm the earth. But what I want to go into detail about tonight is that that's not enough to stop climate change. And moreover, it's going to take a long time to phase fossil fuels out because we're very dependent on them, and the fossil fuel lobby has an enormous amount of power, and so on. And in addition, as the recent documentary produced by Michael Moore points out, the renewable energy is not environmentally benign. It still pollutes. It's better than fossil fuels by far in terms of environmental impact, but we can't rely solely on doing that. Because climate change is not just driven by sending greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, but also by destroying things that absorb carbon, such as trees and plankton. And in addition to that, ruminant animals, such as cows, emit enormous quantities of greenhouse gases, largely methane, which is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, actually. So ruminant animals like cows and sheep and goats and so forth, mainly cows, that's what we have the most of on planet Earth. And in fact, some absurd amount, like I don't know, like 40% of the biomass of mammals on Earth consists of cows. So, they digest the food they eat, and you belch a lot of methane out. And there's like a billion of them on the planet. So that's a huge problem. So if we look at the world leader in climate change, combating climate change, which is China, and there are also other countries such as Bhutan that are doing, and Cuba that are doing similar things on a smaller scale because they're vastly smaller countries. But China is the world leader in terms of a variety of efforts to combat climate change. Now, there's a lot of criticism of China because they are the world hub of manufacturing. Something like 30% of their manufacturing takes place in China, and they have a very large population, 1.4 billion people, so it's somewhere between 17 and 18% of the world's population. So they certainly have a huge carbon footprint, no doubt about that. But they are doing more than anyone else in the world to try and change that. So China has, as of 2020, they have more solar capacity than Europe and the United States combined. Let's see, 238, 242. Yeah, more solar generation, solar panels, etc., than the United States and Europe put together. And that was a couple of years ago, so the gap has grown. By then, they also lead the world in terms of wind energy production, manufacture, and implementation of wind turbines. They lead the world in manufacture and use of electric vehicles. They have far and away the largest amount of high speed and other forms of rail transit. In fact, I was just seeing the other day. Let me see if I can find that. Okay, where'd bookmarks go? That's weird. I cannot find bookmarks in my profile. So bizarre. Okay, I must not have saved it. Okay, anyway, they have 9 out of the top 10 cities in the world in terms of um, subway mileage. And they do burn a lot of coal, but their coal plants are massively more energy efficient and less polluting than the coal plants in the United States, which are much older. It's also implemented a very massive reforestation program. So they're basically stopping the Gobi Desert from expanding in Western China. They've also even encouraged reduced meat consumption. So they're trying to encourage dietary guidelines that would cut meat consumption by 50%. And the reason that's important is because, as I said, um, livestock emit a lot of methane. And in addition, the livestock industry, both due to cutting down trees to create pasture for cows and other ruminants to graze, and also through raising crops that are fed to animals. So you often hear people say, "Oh, you vegans, I'm a vegan. You eat so much soybeans. How can that be good for the environment?" Well, the vast majority of the world's soybeans are in fact grown to feed cattle. So anyway, uh, my point is that we have an example of one country, and there are some others that is more or less headed in the right direction in terms of trying to do something about climate change. It's still a big polluter because it's the world's manufacturing hub. It's a developed country with about 18% of the world's population, but the government plans its development path and very much takes environmental considerations into account, as you can see from all the things I just said about uh, being leaders in terms of things like solar and wind power and mass transit and so forth. It also has cleaned up its air and water pollution to a major extent compared to what was the case 10 or 20 years ago. Okay, so a lot of what I want to say tonight is based on this book by Glenn Mercer called Food is Climate, a response to Al Gore, Bill Gates, Paul Hawken, and the conventional narrative on climate change, which I am a copy editor by profession, used to teach psychology, and I'm still a psychologist, but I make my money through editing, and I edited this book. Um, I know Glenn, he's a great guy, and he knows his stuff. So, anyway, let's have a look at some of the things that he had to say regarding taking a more comprehensive view of climate change that focuses on the multifaceted contributions of animal agriculture to climate change. So Glenn points out that in the last 40 years, just within 4 decades, we've lost a third of the arable land on the planet. Overwhelmingly, that's due to expansion of animal agriculture, increased meat consumption, and so forth. And there are other factors too. Of course, suburban sprawl is a big factor. Just driving or running or walking around Bloomington, where I live, it's easy to see. So much green space has been lost. When I lived in Western Canada for about a year, 30 years ago, already you could see just massive clear cutting in various parts of the um, temperate rainforests of British Columbia. The world has lost as much forest in the last 100 years, Glenn points out, as it had lost in the previous 9,000 years. Greenland's ice melt rate is accelerating, and it's already melting at its fastest rate in 12,000 years. So things are really heating up, so to speak. So, as I said, promoting renewable energy, implementing renewable energy in terms of purchase of electric vehicles and mass transit and solar panels and so on and so forth are great, but they're not going to begin to solve the problem because really the majority of the contribution to climate change is not the burning of fossil fuels. It's a big factor, and it'll help a lot if we drastically cut our use of fossil fuels, but it's a long way from solving the problem. So Glenn says the first clue that we needed to change the terms of the debate came in 2006 when the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN published a report entitled Livestock's Long Shadow. The report pegged greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture at 18% of total greenhouse gas emissions, which is more than that from all forms of transportation combined. So in other words, even if we you had all electric cars and trucks, even if we stopped flying planes or figured out a way to make them non-polluting too, you had mass transit that ran off of electricity that was generated from solar and wind power and other forms of renewable energy. Even if we did all of that, that still wouldn't. Okay, well, now I mentioned something that wasn't transportation there, but I guess you need non-fossil fuel forms of electricity generation to charge vehicles for that to be totally fossil fuel free. But anyway, so 18% is more than the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that come from all forms of transportation, which is about 14%. And the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, is considered to be just like the I forget the Department of Agriculture in the United States. It's considered to be an organization that works hand in glove with agribusiness interests. So, it kind of goes against what they're inclined to say to come out with a stat that, animal agriculture is making a huge contribution to climate change. But because of those interests, the report, despite saying it's a huge percentage of greenhouse gas emissions, they didn't say we need to scale way back on animal agriculture. They said basically things like, we need to breed better cows that don't emit as much methane. We need to change their diet, all this sort of stuff. So it's kind of like saying, well, we need to produce cars that get better gas mileage, but not give up internal combustion engine cars. Now, the FAO's report was not the only report that was done analyzing the impact of animal agriculture. There were others. And just 3 years later, for example, the World Watch Institute, an environmental organization, produced a report entitled Livestock and Climate Change. What if the key actors in climate change are cows, pigs and chickens. And so instead of estimating the contribution of animal agriculture to um, climate change, they came up with the assessment that at least 51% of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change contributions generally should be attributed to animal agriculture. So one thing they pointed out, maybe not a major thing, but not a minor thing either, is that the FAO report had excluded animal respiration. In other words, animals exhale carbon dioxide. That for some reason they take into account the methane produced by cows' digestive processes, which are also mainly exhaled through burping, but they didn't take breathing into account. Even though the reason why plants are helpful is because they do the reverse of animals. They breathe in carbon dioxide and excrete oxygen. That's how we have oxygen to breathe, is because we've got plants that put it out there for us to breathe. They also pointed out that for some reason the FAO didn't accurately count how many cattle and other livestock there were in the world. And various other mistakes. They didn't really accurately account for the impact of deforestation, for example. And maybe the most important weakness of the FAO report was how they treated the contribution of methane to climate change. So methane's an interesting chemical, and I didn't pay attention in high school chemistry, so I'm certainly no expert on this, but basically, from what I can glean from having read about all this, methane ultimately decays into carbon dioxide, but it takes many, many decades. But pound for pound, or however you want to measure it, methane has a global warming potential that's 120 times that of carbon dioxide. So the trick that the FAO played is that they looked at the contribution of methane based on 100 years out from when it was first emitted. So you can see what the problem is here. Basically, because of their industrial capture, I guess, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, in every way, in a variety of ways, biases their estimate to make it seem like animal agriculture is contributing less than it is. So, therefore, they're able to arrive at this conclusion that we don't really need to change that much. But, initially, even though there's a lot less methane emitted by, cows and by burning natural gas and so forth, than is the case with carbon dioxide, and when it's initially emitted, it has 120 times the impact of carbon dioxide. And so that causes the air to heat up, and then that heat gets absorbed into the oceans. And the oceans don't dissipate heat nearly as fast as the atmosphere does. So somebody calculated, a study in the journal PNAS, found that, or estimated that after 100 years, 75% of the thermal expansion. That's the expansion of the ocean caused by it heating up. 75% of the thermal expansion created by uh, methane emissions would still be there 100 years later. As someone put it, the ocean never forgets. Okay, so basically, there are a number of problems with the FAO's estimate. The worst of which is the way they're deceptive accounting with regard to methane. Okay, well, so we have one estimate that's 18% of greenhouse gas emissions coming from animal agriculture, and another estimate that's 51%, a slight majority coming from animal agriculture. Um, but that wasn't the only; those weren't the only estimates. A fellow named Sailesh Rao, um, whose profession is a systems engineer, uh, he started working with Al Gore. He worked for a while as one of Al Gore's trained presenters. So the slideshow that ultimately served as a basis for Gore's documentary about climate change titled An Inconvenient Truth. But Rao and many of his colleagues uh, discovered that they disagreed with former Vice President Gore about a lot of aspects of what was causing climate change. They felt that he was all but ignoring the central role of animal agriculture in warming up the planet and only focusing on the effects of burning fossil fuels. So Rao and 70 other distinguished scientists who were fellow presenters of Gore's Climate Project slideshow. They sent him a letter in 2009 that said, "Dear Mr. Gore, we are climate presenters who have worked to convey the urgency of the climate crisis for nearly 3 years. We find it increasingly difficult to ignore the impacts of the Western diet on the state of the planet, in particular the climate impacts of eating beef and other meats. The 2006 FAO report, Livestock's Long Shadow, estimated that humans use nearly one-third of the ice-free land of the area of the planet, or nearly 12 billion acres, for livestock production. So that's including grazing land and also including cropland that's used to grow food for cows and pigs and chickens and so forth. And it turns out that it takes a lot more crops to feed, particularly cows and pigs, because they're very huge animals, and there are a lot of them, and there are even more chickens. It takes more land to grow food for them, before we kill them, than it does to grow food for us. So they go on to say that the Global Biodiversity Assessment in 1995 estimated that the sustainable population of the planet that could support uh, Western levels of meat, dairy, and egg consumption was just 1 billion people. And we're at 8 billion right now. So, even if we had like a global one child policy, like your tax rates go up enormously if you have more than one child, like they used to have in China until a few years ago. Even if we did that, it would take many, many decades to get down to 1 billion people on the planet. Not practical. Won't get us there soon enough. So they go on to say, and I'm not going through the whole letter here, but they go on to say livestock's enormous footprint is derived from the land use changes required by the industry. Deforestation in the Amazon rainforest is a stark example of this phenomenon. Currently, 70% of Amazon deforestation is for the purpose of providing grazing land for cattle. The remaining 30% occurs to plant soybeans to feed livestock. And, of course, there are other things that that land gets used for, but, overwhelmingly, it's, in one way or another to support the livestock industry. If even half of the land currently used for livestock production worldwide were converted back into forest, and if that forested land sequestered just 1/4 of the carbon that is stored in the native Amazon per acre, the resulting carbon sequestration would offset the next 30 to 40 years of anthropogenic CO2 emissions worldwide. Our conclusion then is that the impact of that livestock production is an elephant in the room that we simply cannot ignore. Uh, Gore wrote back thanking them for their thoughts and acknowledging the importance of eating less meat, but he didn't make any commitment to changing the presentation at all, and he didn't agree that animal agriculture was the elephant in the room. So they wrote back to him a couple years later and talked about additional evidence that had come out since their 2009 letter that indicated that the contribution of animal agriculture was even greater than what they had first said. And he just ignored their letter. And the same is true of all the other people that Glenn mentions in the title of his book. Bill Gates, Paul Hawken, Dennis Kucinich is another one that he mentions, and Kucinich is even a vegan himself, but he hardly ever talks about um, the contribution of animal agriculture to climate change. Neither does Greta Thunberg very often, interestingly enough, even though she's a vegan. So some of the and Al Gore ultimately went vegan too. So some of these people know about this, but they don't talk about it very much. Um, okay, so Celeste, the person I mentioned who initiated the letter to Al Gore about the uh, climate presentation that he and others were giving until they discovered that Gore wouldn't listen to them, uh, did a study of his own um, where he estimated the contribution of animal agriculture to climate change and came up with an even bigger estimate. Let's see. So his report was titled "The Climate Healer's Position Paper," published in the Journal of Ecological Society. Uh, actually, the title and the journal article was "Animal Agriculture is the Leading Cause of Climate Change," a position paper. And his figure was 87% of greenhouse emissions coming from animal agriculture. So a big part of that was a recalculation of methane emissions. In the abstract, he wrote, "We show that the methane emissions from animal agriculture alone cause more incremental global warming than the annual CO2 emissions from all fossil fuel sources combined. We further show that the transition to a global plant-based economy has the potential to sequester over 2,000 gigatons of CO2 in regenerating soils and vegetation, returning atmospheric greenhouse gas levels to the safe zone of under 350 parts per million of CO2 equivalent, etc. The extra 36% versus the World Watch report's 51% comes mainly from Rao's contention that the authors of that report underestimated the carbon opportunity cost of restoring grazing lands. to forest and prairie and so forth. Um, so, whatever estimate you believe, you, the point here, is, whatever estimate is correct, whether it's 51% or 87% or some other number, and I think we can probably dismiss the FAO report estimating 18% because it's just so biased in so many ways. The point is that there's a lot more going on with um, anthropogenic contributions to climate change than just burning fossil fuels. Um, there's direct emissions from um, ruminant livestock. They burp out methane, and of course, all animals breathe out carbon dioxide. Um, but there's a lot more than that. One thing that uh, certainly the FAO didn't take into account was the impact of forest fires. So, forest fires contribute in a wide variety of ways, and it's kind of a process where the warming of the planet, through um, raising the temperature and drying things out, less precipitation, creates the preconditions for the number of forest fires to increase, and so it's kind of a vicious cycle. And um, so, what forest fires do is, first of all, they produce carbon dioxide and methane and many other greenhouse gases. Of course, they destroy trees, which were previously sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, uh, respirating carbon in and carbon dioxide in and oxygen out, the reverse of what animals do. And third of all, uh, forest fires degrade the soil, and soil, due to the various organisms in it, primarily that do the same thing as trees, they sequester more carbon than the trees. So the destruction of the planet's topsoil is a major environmental problem, and it's overlooked as a contributor to climate change. And of course, a lot of fires are uh, deliberately set to clear land for various purposes, either for grazing or to grow crops that are in turn fed to animals, and various other purposes. Um, and of course, lots of trees are simply chopped down, clear cut, either to clear land for pasture or to clear land for development or to contribute to the pulp and paper industry, um, or housing construction, so on and so forth. Um, Even before the modern, since we've had records of temperature and all that, um, industry driven, um, or industrialization driven, I guess I should say, uh, acceleration of climate change. It was already slowly starting to happen, we think, uh, ever since uh, large scale agriculture became a thing. Once humans moved out of hunter and gatherer societies and started um, not only growing crops but also raising lots of livestock. So as you probably know, kind of the cradle of civilization is in an area, where humans originated, is in an area that's now mostly desert. And you might wonder, well, how could it be that uh, the initial human civilizations were in an area that's now desert? Well, um, the reason is that it wasn't desert back then. A few thousand years ago, it was known as the Fertile Crescent. It was where agriculture was born, and there was a lot of fertile soil there. There were lots of forests, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now you have in that same area the Sahara and Gobi deserts. What happened? Well, you most likely, Glenn points out, those deserts were likely created in part by agriculture, particularly by grazing. So the main ruminant animal they had back then was goats. So they eat enough plants. Not only do they destroy the plants, but they expose the soil to drying out in the sun and erosion by rain and so forth, blows off in the wind, etc. And the most fertile part of the soil, the top level, of course, goes away first. So whereas 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert, but an area full of forests and grasslands and bodies of water, that changed. An archaeologist named David Wright published a study that proposed that early humans may have brought an early end to the humid climate that existed at a time in northern Africa by overgrazing grasses, therefore drying up the air, reducing precipitation, cutting down trees, etc., using fire to clear land, and all of that. So we have this expanding desert. Even in just the last 100 years, the Sahara Desert is estimated to have expanded by 10%. So right now, about 37% of the land area of the Earth that doesn't have ice covering it is grazing land. And a lot of the remainder is land that's used to grow crops for animals. Now, as I mentioned before, fortunately, China is trying to do something about that. So, in China, they call the Gobi Desert, which is the biggest desert in that part of the world, the Yellow Dragon. And to counter the expanding Yellow Dragon, they are building the Great Green Wall, which is a reforestation program that China has undertaken in the last couple of decades, or actually launched in 1978, but expanded in recent years. But as I mentioned briefly last time, it's easy to overlook that what's happening on land is not the only problem. We can't see what's going on in the oceans as easily as we can see what's going on land, but that may actually be, in terms of destruction of carbon sinks, things that can absorb carbon dioxide and so forth. The oceans may be more important than the land. For one thing, there's more ocean than there is land. It's 70% of the Earth's surface, and it's often very deep as well. So in the ocean, you have a variety of plants and animals called plankton that are the main carbon sinks in the ocean. So oceans are full of plankton, including algae and various both plant and animal microorganisms. Various animals, particularly whales, eat the plankton, um, and also whales and other animals that eat plankton uh, bring nutrients up from the bottom of the ocean to the surface, and the plankton feed on them. And the carbon capture potential of increased plankton in the oceans is um, very huge. So if we increase the amount of plankton in the ocean by 1%, that's basically equivalent to planting uh, 2 billion or having 2 billion trees planted and maturing, and then having matured. So it's huge. But what's happening is a wide variety of things that are killing off the plankton and other ocean life. Of course, there's rising ocean temperatures. That's the main factor, and that's led to a decline in the plankton population that's estimated to be at about 40% since 1950, 70, some years ago. So almost half of the plankton are gone. And we're plundering the oceans directly as well as indirectly. Of course, we're doing things on land like breeding massive amounts of livestock. So between humans and animals, something like 97% of the biomass of animals on our planet is now either humans or livestock. Only 3% is wild animals. Um, so that's just a huge amount of, in particular, methane that's being emitted by the ruminant livestock. Plus, all the deforestation and topsoil destruction and so forth is, warming the planet, which in turn warms the atmosphere, warms the ocean, and that causes death of plankton, which kills whales and dolphins and so forth. And then, we directly hunt whales and dolphins. Despite a ban on whaling, they still kill whales. They still kill dolphins. Um, not a good situation. Okay, so let's try to summarize here. So, the story we've been told about climate change is that, first of all, there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Traps heat and warms the planet. They don't really talk about methane, just CO2. And the story is the leading cause of the crisis is the burning of fossil fuels for energy generation, transportation, manufacturing, etc. And so the solution is to transition to clean energy source like solar and wind power, and using more energy efficient appliances, insulating our houses, getting rid of incandescent light bulbs, driving hybrid or electric vehicles, mass transit, etc. And that's a convenient story because all you have to do is you basically live the same life you've been living, except drive, an electric or hybrid car instead of a gas guzzling truck or SUV or something. Get more efficient light bulbs, insulate your house better, etc. But some of those things are not that easy for people to afford too. But the point is, it's not asking people to make any major changes, like go vegan, like I am, or even cut down on meat consumption, or and it doesn't require that much change in the economy. Sure, fossil fuel companies will decline in business and go out of business, or more likely, they'll shift into um, renewable energy as an investment or some other investment. They're just corporations trying to make money. They can do that by investing however they choose. And in fact, some of the oil companies are really big in the solar panel production industry, actually. But the real story is this: the crisis is we have too many molecules of not only carbon dioxide, but methane and black carbon, soot or whatever, and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. And methane has, at the time that it's first emitted, a global warming potential that dwarfs that of carbon dioxide. It's probably driving more global warming or climate change, which is the sum total of changes in a climate resulting from uh, greenhouse gas emissions and other causes. Methane's probably driving more climate change than any other greenhouse gas because it's so much more potent. And the biggest emitters of methane are ruminant animals, kind of a tie between ruminant animals and certain fossil fuels, natural gas, but the majority by ruminant animals. And the oceans are dying, something that you won't hear Greenpeace or the Sunrise Movement or any of the other groups talk about very much. The leading causes of the crisis, fossil fuel burning is a big contributor, but the main cause, it appears from both the World Watch study and the more recent study by Sailesh Rao and his colleagues, is animal agriculture. There are 25 billion livestock in the world. In the case of ruminants such as cows, sheep, goats, etc., they're belching tons of methane, producing lots of waste that generates more methane and nitrous oxide. And of course, we have to grow crops to feed them, unless you're talking about exclusively grass-fed ruminants, which we don't have enough land to do that for all the grazing animals that exist in the world. More than a third of the land surface of the earth is occupied by grazing animals, and growing crops. So trees are being cut down. Other things like the soil are being destroyed, et cetera, et cetera. Forest fires, deforestation, and meanwhile, the oceans are being raped by fisheries worldwide. It's estimated we'll lose, basically the vast majority of species of fish that people regularly eat are likely to be extinct in a few decades. And dolphins and whales are dying, plankton are dying. So, what do we do about it? Well, the quickest way to have an impact is to reduce methane concentrations in the atmosphere, and the quickest way to do that is to stop eating so much damn meat. So, we need to end the practice of ruminant grazing and reforest the land everywhere we can. And we need to reduce the quantity of livestock in the world. Even if we cut that down by half, like, people ate 50% less meat, and to a lesser extent, other animal products, like China has set out as its objective, that would do a hell of a lot. But there's other things we need to consider. Big part of the reason why this hashtag in fossil fuels uh, goal has been the only objective that's really talked about much by the climate change movement, is that uh, switching to a fossil fuel free economy you know, basically leaves our economic system alone. Uh, so all these industries that are contributing to climate change uh, are doing so because it's profitable, and as long as they can continue to find ways to make profits, they'll continue to do so, and more than likely they'll keep doing things that pollute the environment and emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases. As long as we have a global economy that's overwhelmingly is driven by the profit motive, we're not going to do what we need to do to mitigate the impact of um, climate change and ultimately halt it. Because a capitalist economic system is predicated on infinite growth, and we have a finite planet. But we're not going to overthrow capitalism overnight. So we do have to take whatever steps we can in the meantime. One thing I've noticed over the last few years is that there's been a lot of talk by environmentalists and people on the left about how certain corporations bear primary responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions. And we hear about what an enormous greenhouse gas emitter the U.S. military is. That, if it were a country, it would be something like, I think it was like the 50th ranked country in the world in terms of fossil fuel emissions. But the 50th ranked country in the world is a pretty small country. It's not a huge greenhouse gas emitter. You compare it to the U.S. or China or other large countries, and there's large wealthy countries. There's really no comparison. And the U.S. military emits less than 1% of the greenhouse gases that we emit in the U.S. as a whole. Plus, it doesn't take into account things like deforestation and soil depletion and all the other stuff that I've talked about. We heard last year about how much methane was emitted when the Nord Stream pipeline was sabotaged, which journalist Seymour Hersh found a lot of evidence to suggest was a U.S. government-directed sabotage operation. And it was the largest single event in human history, caused by humans anyway, in terms of emission of methane. But that's just one event. A lot more methane than that is being emitted every single day around the world, and other greenhouse gases, all the other stuff that we've talked about. So things like blowing up pipelines and the U.S. military, comparatively speaking, they're a drop in the bucket alongside the everyday emissions and carbon sink destruction that I've been talking about for the past however long we've been going here. What are we up to, by the way? An hour. So all this sort of rhetoric seems to me to be in part intended to absolve us of personal responsibility for climate change, to suggest that it's not our fault, and the only path forward is to pressure industries and governments to change policies so that they're encouraging renewable energy and discouraging fossil fuels, and then ultimately get rid of those governments, bring about governments that are socialists, that can center development and industry around meeting human needs in an ecologically sustainable way, rather than centering it around making money for rich people. And certainly there are rich people in China, and they do have capitalism, but ultimately, the government is in charge of the main levers of the economy, and use that to, among other things, plan development in a way that is vastly more climate friendly than certainly the country where I live, the United States, does. Okay, well, I think that's necessary. We do need to, you have an economic system globally that isn't profit driven, that takes ecological sustainability into account to a vastly greater extent than is the case right now, among many other things, of course. But, although that's necessary, it's going to take some time. We're not going to get there overnight any more than we're going to reduce the population by a few billion people anytime in the near future. And we're not even going to, even though that seems to be the central, or it is the central objective of the environmental movement at the present time, is to phase out fossil fuels. That's going to take quite a long time too. Even China isn't estimating that it will be carbon neutral in terms of not centering energy use around renewables rather than fossil fuels until something like 2050. So that means we have to look at ourselves as individuals to make changes. There's an enormous amount that we can do ourselves in the short run. The easiest thing we can do, and also incidentally the cheapest thing we can do, as long as you don't buy a bunch of processed foods, is to dramatically reduce our animal product consumption. Which why not? Plants are delicious. Even if we season our food with plants. Spices are all from plants, sauces, etc. Eating a plant-based diet will save you money, and it's also very healthy, and of course, kinder to animals. But as far as the topic of this video, the big thing is that it's really key to mitigating and ultimately ending climate change, mitigating the impact of climate change. And of course, we also need to do what we can to reduce our consumption of carbon-emitting energy in other ways. So, okay, yeah, car companies and fossil fuel companies, etc., are responsible for producing one of the main sources of greenhouse gases, the burning of fossil fuels. But, who's consuming that? It's all of us who own cars and, so on and so forth. Run our gas-powered lawnmowers, etc. So, ultimately, we do need to do what we can to reduce our consumption of gas and oil. So, if you live in a big city with decent public transportation, if you're lucky enough to live in China, where every major city has great mass transit, and there's great mass transit between cities. But even if you don't, if you live in a city like Washington D.C. or New York, even though New York's subway system is old and decrepit, it's still very extensive. You can use it. You can bike or walk on short trips. Next time you're in the market for a car, if you can afford a car, and if you can't afford a car, well, you're not contributing in that way, right? But if you can afford a car, next time you're in the market for another car, your car is wearing out or whatever, you get, an electric vehicle, or, at least a hybrid. And, especially if you buy a used one, it's a lot less expensive than you might think. Maintenance and energy costs are far cheaper. So, it's a good investment, and will reduce your carbon footprint. So, long story short, in fossil fuels is too narrow a perspective. Part of the reason for that is that much of the environmental movement is still wedded to the idea that this one change that doesn't require us to significantly change our lifestyles other than having vehicles that use different forms of energy and buying different light bulbs, insulating our house better, uh, getting a more energy efficient furnace when we replace ours, if we can afford it, investing in some solar panels, etc. Um, you know, uh, it's not requiring us to live that differently from the way we do now. Um, you know, we can still have big houses and still travel everywhere by car, etc. Um, and a lot of the environmental movement, and not necessarily the more radical elements, certainly not Cornel West, who spoke at the climate change rally a couple weeks ago. But a lot of the environmental movement is still wedded to the idea that capitalism is compatible with ecological sustainability, and it's not, because the capitalism is like a shark that's got to keep swimming. Supposedly, I don't know if this is actually true, but supposedly sharks have to keep swimming in order to keep breathing. Similarly, capitalism has to keep growing in order to sustain itself. We live on a finite planet. Capitalism's predicated on infinite growth, so we can't have a economic system globally that's predicated on the profit motive. It won't work. And in general, we need to have a broader understanding of what's driving climate change, not just fossil fuel use, but animal agriculture and other practices that contribute to, and I'd have to put producing palm oil in there too, because they cut down a lot of forests to grow palm oil palm trees in certain parts of the world. In other parts of the world, they grow it without cutting down so many forests. But anyway, anything we do that results in deforestation or soil depletion or methane emissions, we have to change. And we got to stop overfishing the oceans. We've got to stop polluting them so much and warming them so much that the carbon absorbing capacity of oceans is continually being greatly diminished. So we need to have a broader understanding of what's driving climate change, of what we need to change to stop it. It's going to require both individual action, some lifestyle changes that are more significant than switching the type of engine that runs our car, and it's going to require collective action on a massive scale. Okay, well, I hope this has been interesting for you, and I will see you next time.